Welcome, everybody. This is very exciting to have you all here. We're going to start or have the official launch of Climares, Climate Resilience in African Context. We will be talking about this a bit more. My name is Caroline Jacobs. I'm from Leiden University. I will be part of the coordination team with many people of ISS here. And I guess I will give the floor now to Roert Ganzenvoort, who is the rector of ISS, to welcome you all here at this venue.
Good afternoon, and what a splendid opportunity. I mean, a big project, to launch a big project is always a party, and it's great to have you all around the table. But I must say I'm extremely and exceptionally interested and happy with this project, and I will tell you why. We often talk about the wicked problems in the world, and the wicked problems are, let's say, they need more than just one solution. They need more than just one view, one perspective. And that's nice talk. But how to really do that, how to really take approaches that take these wicked problems, approach them from all these different perspectives, bring that together in a coherent way and take a next step towards solutions, that's easier said than done. Now, of course, we don't know the outcome of this project. We don't know whether we will succeed or everything that's, but at least this project intends from the very start to do exactly that. And what we have today around the table, I think, is already indicative of what we try to achieve in the project as a whole, and what makes me as a rector also proud that we can serve as a host to this project. Proud because the intention of really bringing together people from a more technical side, from a more political side, from the more academic side, different academic disciplines, from social sciences to the technical science and so on, bringing together people from the private sector as well, and from different parts of the world, specifically, of course, Africa and here, and trying to build all that in equitable relationships. It's a hell of a job, but when it works, it's really something. So thank you so much for coming. I'm not going to speak long. I'm here to listen. But thanks for coming and to bring all these perspectives to the table. Thanks for being part of Climares, because I think that's true for many of you. And if you're not a part of it, you are a part of it because you are interested in it. And that's part of the participation, I would say. So thank you so much for being here. Bring all that to the table, and let's make something extremely, exceptionally, beautifully out of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Thea Hilhorst, who is one of the PIs of the project. And I guess all of you know her, so she doesn't need a lot of introduction. She's obviously here based at ISS, leading the Hague Humanitarian Studies Center. Thank you, Thea.
Thank you, Caroline, and welcome everyone again. It's really a major pleasure to be here. We were, I think it's been, I don't recall actually, like 1.5 years ago or even longer, that we started to prepare for this consortium, that we started to bid, that we started to, of course, compete with a few others and really make the best and the most of it. And then we get rewarded. And then it takes another half year at least before you can actually start. And here we are today. So that's really great. I'm going to explain to you a bit about the program. Of course, there's many people from within the consortium here, but also a few from without. So it will be nice to proudly present the program. And I also want to say thank you first, before I forget, to Martijn Winia. I'm so glad you're here, Martijn. Martijn is from NWO. And of course, we are in general very grateful to NWO because they finance this program. But we're also specifically grateful to Martijn because at some very crucial moments, he has sort of helped us to navigate the complications of starting a huge project as it is. So thanks, Martijn, and nice to see you here. Okay. The call for this program started from NWO with the objective around resilience against climate change of vulnerable people in Africa. So that spoke to all of us. Now, when we were reading the call again, there was a kind of almost assumption inside the call that it would mean that you would have better data, better weather data, better prediction models on how the weather will change in Africa. However, talking to experts, talking to all kinds of people, some of them here again, like the KNMI, Robert was also very important in there he is in formulating the way we did it. we sort of stepped a bit away and we said, no, yes, climate data is important, but there are also people working on it. Huge program, billions of dollars, getting more satellites up there. However, what is also very important now is to make all those data actionable. First. Second, to make sure that the information from below also comes into the models, because we may have very many climate data, but the information from below is often missing. So we wanted to set out, I'm taking you along the road of how we did Climares. So we set out to think like, okay, we want actionability of data, and we want it from kind of, sort of the focus on below, realizing that climate is not a thing. It doesn't affect people in a particular kind of way. Climate is sort of a very sneaky thing that interacts with all kind of other factors, and people already had problems before climate change. So those problems haven't gone away, they're still there. So how do you make a program out of these muffled problems, super complex, without, only concluding after 7 years, wow, it is actually really complex. So where we ended up was, and that was our eureka moment, if we want to work with specific population groups, that might be the key to our approach, because very often climate research is around an area, a climate zone, or a river basin. We thought if we work with population groups, that has very strong advantages. One is they share climate-related issues and problems. So they share not only the climate-related issues, but also the other ones. I mean, for people who are smallholders, they care about climate change, but they also care about the fact that their product is now not, the world market prices for their product is very low. So there are these kind of problems that they share, climate and non-climate related. Very often population groups are already organized. They are organized either in community-based organizations or advocacy groups. If you travel somewhere, you all know this, like the people who carry your luggage through town, they have their carrying the luggage association, those kind of things I'm talking about. And they also therefore have similar climate service needs, because that's what it's all about, the climate service needs that people have in relation to both early warning and climate projections. We are not only speaking about the weather tomorrow, we're also speaking about the weather in a few years. And we are not only speaking about what the weather will be, but we will speak especially about what the weather will do. That is what Climares is about. What is also interesting about working with population groups is that they are surrounded by sets of stakeholders that can support early action and adaptation activities. So if you take a sectoral approach, say fisheries, you have the Ministry of Fisheries. So you already know as well, like who could be the institutions surrounding the stakeholders, but not only state institutions, it could also be commercial parties. If you take pastoral people with cattle, it's also in the interest of the trade, the cattle trader, that the cattle comes alive to the market. So we were thinking of bringing together people both with commercial, non-commercial, value-based interest, etc., etc. Next slide. All right, so what we came up with is this idea of knowledge and action networks. Sorry, this is an old name here. Knowledge and action networks. Knowledge and action network are exactly what I was trying to already lead you into. Groups of organizations and peoples that have a common interest in the climate resilience of that specific group. So just to give you a better idea of how this could work, I took here the example of fisher folks no, you can go back, sorry. The fisher folks in Senegal, and that starts with community-based organization. We have identified all of them for 11 of those networks. We already identified them all in the preparation. So you have the community-based, the local fishery organizations in Saint Louis, Island of Saloum. We all contact these people. Then we have weather, disaster, climate stakeholders. That is, of course, the Meteo, also the radio stations that issue the weather forecast, the West African Science Service Center on Climate Change and Adapted Land Use. So there's all this, there's public and private stakeholders, the local fishery administration, but also the people who are involved in the market. And then at the global level, you have international organizations, ECOWAS, and the Regional Fisheries Commission. So even at regional and international level, there are already institutions that are also interested in population groups. So that is the idea of knowledge and action networks. Next. So what we will do is we work with 11 PhD candidates. Now we thought, I'm sure you have a lot of patience, but to introduce 11 people who are not here one by one, we thought that is perhaps pushing it a little bit. So what we did instead, I don't know if you noticed, those of you who were in a bit, before we actually started, we ran a photo compilation. So you could have seen all the 11 PhD candidates. And they all had their introduction, their photo with some descriptions. And that will all also come to the Climares website. So if you are interested to hear who are the 11 PhD candidates, you can also find it, not yet, but maybe next week on the website of Climares. They all introduced themselves. They have been recruited over the last 7 months, and we are super excited. We have a really, really interesting mix of PhD candidates. Now, they will work both at the community level and at the level of the knowledge and action network actors. So we have been looking for PhD candidates who are not just interested in doing research, academic work, but they're also interested in making it actionable, in activating, in mobilizing, in organizing. That's why we give them more time. They will all have 5 years for their PhD. So at the local level, they will work with Opinion. Pinar is there, Noor is here. If you want to talk with them in the break afterwards, it's really nice. They are super clever people. They have been making a kind of... Pinar, can you just say it in 2 sentences, what you do? So no, but and the beauty of it, it's a two-way communication channel. So we will collect information through the platforms, but at some point we can also connect those platforms to the Meteo to sort of supply, for example, information about the weather tomorrow. So all these things can be integrated in the platform. Of course, we are social scientists, most of us. We will not only rely on digital, we will also do proper field work and really go into qualitative data collection at the local level. At the same time, they will be organizing these knowledge action networks consisting of, as I mentioned, all these different stakeholders. And then they will get together once in a while to see what is going on. At a later stage, first it's data collection. At some point we will actually do, and I think Chris, the co-PI, principal investigator, is Jack. He will speak later. He will probably explain to you what it means when you do a climate storyline. That's what we want to do with these groups. Next. How we will do the job? That is because we are a really great group of people. You can see us there on the balcony. We have been very co-creative from the beginning, and we care to say that here too, that of course, first we had to find the countries. You don't want to raise expectations all over the world. So we started with a group here in the Netherlands from different universities. But as soon as we realized, okay, these would be good countries to work in for a variation of climate zones, but also governance systems, and also a bit of variation in terms of where they are on the Human Development Index. Did I mention the countries? Not yet. Oh, it's Morocco, it's Senegal, it's Mozambique, it's Uganda, and it's DRC. And the way we did it is in each of those countries, we work with 2 population groups. In DRC, 3. Mozambique with urban, especially very vulnerable for heat wave. We work with being cash. We work with refugee is not a professional group, of course, but they also have their stakeholders and their own problems. DRC, we work with refugees and fisheries. Senegal, we work with fisheries and pastoralists. Outdoor workers. So we have countries, or we can write about 2 sectors in one country, plenty of ways in which we can actually generate knowledge that is generalizable to a sector, to a country, perhaps to the continent. And what we really hope is show to the larger world like how this approach with knowledge action networks can work. One thing that is very important, we also link up those networks to the global level. So we have a special work pack about it. She will speak later, where we connect those knowledges again mutually. We feed the global with knowledge we gather at the local level, but also it's intelligence work. Joita is our like spy at the international level, and she brings back all kind of interesting opportunities to our population groups, like make sure that our population groups are mentioned in all those reports that emanate from the global. So we have great partnerships. We work here in the Netherlands with 5, 6 universities. Sorry, never mind. A lot of universities. We work in each of the countries with different universities. Plus we have a partner in South Africa where Christopher Jack is working, the co-PI. And the 11 PhD candidates that are really, as I mentioned, very promising people, all of them with a nice mix of social science, more climate science. And interestingly, many of them didn't have to be put in one category. So many of them didn't, in their master program, they already felt like it's important to approach these problems in an interdisciplinary way. So they cannot be identified anymore as purely climate science or purely social science. So we really like that. Finally, can I still use 1 minute? Thank you. Finally, I wanted to say something about the Climares Academy. That's one of my pet parts of this whole program. I really love this. So we break away from the standard approach to PhD projects, which is, you start a year preparing, then 1.5 years you do data collection, and then 1.5 years you write. Now, I know this is a bit of a caricature. There are many variations in reality, but that's a standard. Instead, we use a traineeship model. So our PhD candidates will go to school 1 day a week, and the rest of the week they are working in their own environment. So 1 day we go to school, it's a virtual thing, of course. They have to report online for education, debate, coursework, intervision, supervision, all those things we will do 1 day a week under the glorious leadership of Sonja Fransen. And of course, it's not nice to have this kind of traineeship model from the beginning if you don't know each other. So we start with a very intensive training course, 2 months, with one of our partners in Rabat. And so the 11 will travel early October to Rabat, and then they will be having every week a couple of teachers, partly African, partly Dutch, that come to Rabat and take them in a course of 1 week. So they have like weekly programs, and then the teachers are replaced and the people stay. That is happening for more than 2 months. And then we have an inception week in Marrakesh, which is bringing the whole consortium together. So we are climate conscious, so we don't do this every year, but we felt like face-to-face interaction is also important, isn't it? So at least this time, at the beginning of the project, we say sorry to the environment and we bring everybody to Marrakesh for a real face-to-face meeting. And to compensate for that, I'm going to travel there by car. I'm not going to take the plane. And that is in October as well. So this is Climares in a nutshell.
Yeah, thanks very much, Thea, for this introduction. I think many of you are familiar to some extent with this, but it's good to refresh our minds as well. Next on our list, we have Joella van Rijn, and I'm really happy that she's here. She's a Senior Climate Adaptation Advisor at the climate team of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And she's going to reflect on our project, but also give us suggestions on how we can link our project to other nice initiatives that the ministry is supporting. And Joella has a lot of experience, I think, as a biologist by training, has worked a lot on climate change issues as a diplomat. So I'm sure she's also happy with the interdisciplinary perspective that we are bringing in to this with this project. And I'm very curious to hear what you have to say and how you think about our project. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you for inviting me. Indeed, I'm very happy with this opportunity to connect. My name is Joëlla van Rijn. I'm climate advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And normally I sit behind a cardboard saying the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and I have 1 minute to say what I need to say. So I'm also grateful for the generous speaking time, and I will try to make the most of it. First, I'd like to congratulate you all with this beautiful program. It's undeniably important to know more about the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations, and to know what adaptation and anticipatory action measures can help them to create more resilience. And it's even more important to build a knowledge base on this item with these communities together, focusing on their specific wisdom and on their specific needs. Caroline asked me to reflect a little bit on the added value of this activity and with a view on other ongoing activities. I'm happy to give it a try. But of course, there are many activities ongoing. And I think Climares is going to benefit a lot from the enormous network of the African universities and all the Dutch universities. And it will be able maybe to make a map of everything relevant that's going on. But I will give it a try from my perspective. Long ago, before I took the role of policy advisor, I wore the hat of a scientist, and my relationship with knowledge was quite clear-cut by that time. Knowledge was power, and because we wanted power, we studied. It was also a rather positive time, as I remember it. Knowledge and power were still happily married, and together achieved beautiful things: more sustainable production, environmental protection, global connections. Now it sometimes seems that knowledge and power are fighting all the time in a nasty divorce process. And I don't know if you experience the same, but these days I see situations in which power focuses on short-term solutions in situations where knowledge is already available to solve the problem once and for all. It is more difficult to communicate facts for policy advisors, and I assume for you as well as scientists. For the sake of results, you sometimes present a limited version of reality to avoid adverse effects. And geopolitics seem to determine if we listen to each other, if we work together more than anything else. So for the PhD candidates, I think they are listening from their home bases. I think you are starting this project in a challenging time for the policy knowledge nexus. But it's also an instructive time. And what we learned as policy advisors from the current confusion, let's put it this way, is that the transfer of knowledge depends primarily on relationships. If the listener doesn't trust the messenger, the fact is not accepted either. When it comes to the added value of Climares, I believe that this aspect of relationships, creating networks, maintaining networks around knowledge is a very, very strong point and is defining the added value, besides all the scientific gains that may come from it. Caroline probably assumed that at DGIS we have a complete overview of everything happening in the region. This is unfortunately not the case. There are so many channels for development cooperation, and especially development cooperation in the field of knowledge is still quite fragmented. So I think Climares can have a role there as well to link existing activities to map what is going on in the region. Can you please show the sheet? Because there are 4 activities, Dutch activities, I wanted to point your attention to, because I think that they can benefit from the results of Climares, and maybe Climares can benefit from what they already learned. The first one is water at the heart of climate action. This is an activity that aims to strengthen observation, monitoring, and early warning capacities to support resilience in vulnerable communities in Ethiopia, Rwanda, South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda. And the partnership involves the Red Cross and Red Crescent local societies in the 5 countries, but it also involves a consortium of multilateral agencies, the World Meteorological Organization, the United Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Systematic Observation Financing Facility, and the Red Cross Climate Center. The Climate Center is a partner in Climares as well, of course. Yeah. So by bridging the local experience and wisdom of the local emergency societies and the multilateral policy and knowledge level, the actionability on either sides is improving. Although this consortium is now depending on a Dutch contribution, they already decided they want to maintain their work, their cooperation, when the grant expires, because this water at heart model of working is so beneficial to them. So they try to attract new donors now to the same model. The second one, you might know it, is not an African entertainment activity at all. It is focusing on the Netherlands. It is a NL 2120. It is a frame in which science, business, government, environmental, and education partners together are working on upscaling natural-based solutions and for climate challenges. Well, this program is not focusing on the region. I think it's interesting because of the knowledge hubs that they are creating and they're working in. Probably you at ISS, you are common with this program. And besides that, of course, the solutions found in that program have universal value. And we are also, at Foreign Affairs, we are also presenting these solutions sometimes to our partners. The third one is reversing the flow, and reversing the flow aims to make communities more resilient with locally led adaptation approaches. In Africa, it works in Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Sudan. In every country, local partners have been identified which support dozens of local communities, informal grassroots communities. So this is a structure that you are thinking about in Climares as well. And reversing the flow has a very interesting active community of practice. And we would like to, if you think it's interesting, we can look if we can connect the both communities of practice. Because in reversing the flow, in this practice, people are very open about the challenges in changing traditional working relations. And for example, in the financial chain, to give the local level much more decision room. And so the way of working is changing and people are communicating about that very openly. So I thought it could be useful perhaps for Climares as well. And then last, but certainly not least, is step change. Step change is an activity which is, I think now for 15 years, is investing in southern-based networks to drive inclusive locally led adaptation. It is a partnership between the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Canadian Institute for Development Research. And the program is active worldwide, but there are many African countries involved. Through the funding of the African Synthesis Center for Climate, Environment and Development, the program is even including one of your partners, UCT. And at the basis of step change is the recognition that Jeanette mentioned, that while new knowledge is always needed, we do know enough now to act on climate change. When we think about the slowness with which society is reacting to the challenges of climate change, you can see that the problem we have is not a knowledge problem in the traditional sense. It is a knowledge to action problem. How do we bring what we know to what we do? And this program is therefore organized to many organizations, also to the scientific world. For example, one of the partners, CDKM, also in Cape Town, based in Cape Town, has trained IPCC scientists writing a special report on cities. And they have also trained the Paris Committee on Capacity Building from the UNFCCC and other scientists. So, which we probably could connect with what you are doing in the ministerial meeting of the G20 on disaster risk reduction. He will visit CDKN as well, and I think we might have a good opportunity to explore whether there is added value in connecting the practice, the working groups of change and then Tia also suggested that we, on short term, that we organize with a few colleagues at the ministry or here an encounter. And I think Laurent is very pleased to hear that too. And our two other colleagues who are eager to look at how we can connect and where the added value. Okay, more common. So we'll try to explore that on short term. And in conclusion, I would like to congratulate you once again on this wonderful program. And thank you for the excellent opportunity to connect. I am convinced that knowledge to action networking is a powerful remedy to heal the troubled relationship between knowledge and power. And we are eagerly awaiting the results of Climares. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Joël. I realized that I had the speaking notes in my head, and that is always a bit risky. I mentioned the Dutch university partners, but I forgot to say that we have other partners too. So we already mentioned Upinion. I put her on the spot, but also the Red Crescent Climate Center is playing a major role. It's actually the biggest partner in the consortium, and also Deltares. Ruben is also here. So we are really pleased with those partners too. And I feel really bad that I forgot to mention them. So,
good addition. Thanks very much, Joëlla. I think it's really nice to see. It's also nice that this launch already served as a moment to connect us better to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and to the climate team there. And it's also in a way reassuring, at least I find it, to hear of all these existing initiatives to sort of in these rather gloomy times to realize that there is a lot of also initiatives and momentum going on to make things work a bit better. So I think that's good to hear. Next on our list, we have Christopher Jack, who is attending online. He already recorded his contribution because he wasn't sure whether the internet connection would be stable or good enough to speak directly. He's a research fellow at the University of Cape Town, but also connected to the Climate Center. And he's one of the PIs along with Thea. And he comes also more from a natural sciences background, but has been doing lots of interdisciplinary work, combining a focus on physical and social dimensions of climate change, and also very much and very strongly societally engaged in his work. So I look forward to hear his contribution. If you can start this.
Good afternoon, everyone. And greetings from Cape Town in the southern tip of South Africa. I decided to pre-record this talk just in case the internet didn't work very well, which sometimes happens in these situations. But I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. It would have been amazing to meet many of you and join in the conversation that I'm sure are having. So just in case I haven't been introduced, my name is Christopher Jack, and I'm a climate scientist based down at the University of Cape Town. And playing a bit of leadership role in the Climares project. So I was privileged to be asked to provide a bit of an input into this launch event today. And so that's what we're going to dive into now. Let me just start sharing my screen before I get too far down the road. There we go. Okay, so yeah, as I said, climate scientists at the University of Cape Town. So my background is in physical climate science, climate modeling, and downscaling, but also one of the co-leads of the science team for the Red Crescent Climate Center. I wasn't sure what to talk about, and often not sure exactly what to talk about in these kind of events. So generally what I do is talk about something that I'm really passionate about. And the one thing I'm most passionate about is stories. And so I've entitled my talk, Weaving Stories About Climate Risk and Resilience. Stories are really central actually to the Climares project. We brought the idea of storylines into the project. It's one of the work packages. So we'll dive a lot into the details of storylines and story thinking within the Climares project. But today I'm not going to dive into those details. I just want to talk to you about what I'm passionate about. So about the stories and how we get there. But I wanted to start going back a little bit. So probably 10, 15 years ago, this was the story I was most familiar with as a climate scientist. Not this particular graph, but definitely producing the data and the numbers to produce these kinds of plots. And there was a key moment for me where I was involved in a workshop here in South Africa around climate projections for the country, a workshop that we're very familiar with, these kind of workshops where we're all presenting results from our different projects. And there was a tea break. And as an introvert, I don't enjoy tea breaks very well. I'm getting better, but I tend to sort of skirt around the edges of the tea breaks and listen to other people's conversations most of the time. And I was really struck in that particular tea break. I'm not sure what happened then, but I suddenly realized that all these scientists who spend their lives producing data and numbers were telling stories, somewhat related to what had been going on in the session, but really there were narratives and stories around climate change and risk and vulnerability and decision-making and politics and economics. They were weaving these stories together. And it was the first time I really realized the centrality of story and narrative in everything that we're doing. And as climate scientists producing numbers, we're just part of that picture of stories. We're producing a certain type of story. And that got me really interested and tried to thinking a lot around narratives and the role that narrative plays in lives, in decision-making, and particularly in responding to climate change. So another really key point for me was the Day Zero drought for the city of Cape Town. So I'm sure most of you will have heard about the Day Zero drought, where the city of Cape Town almost ran out of water. And for many of us living through this, and particularly for the climate scientists and many others, engineers as well, many of us stood back and said, how could this happen? How could we get to a point in a city that is fairly well run, though that's a whole debate in itself, but a really well run city? How could we get to a point of almost running out of water? Surely there was scenarios and planning around this kind of event. And of course there were, and many of us had actually been involved in them and contributed the science to them. And this is an example of one scenario. We have scenarios of water resource planning for the city of Cape Town, including a climate change scenario. Here there was thinking around, all the way back in 2014, thinking around a reduction in rainfall. And these scenarios were produced back in around 2009, so quite a few years before the Day Zero drought. So there was information, there was evidence, there was scenario planning, but we still ran into a problem. And we can debate around why that is. But the key thing for me was realizing that we can have all this evidence and science, but we still run into problems. So there's gaps in the process and gaps in thinking around how we respond to climate change. The other really important thing around the Day Zero drought, and this is just to highlight another story. This is the declining production of the water supply system. So you can see going down to about 50% of what it should have been able to supply. This was the sort of central narrative of the Day Zero drought, is reduced water supply. But the other narratives were slower to emerge and were often silenced in many ways. The city imposed water restrictions, including 350 liters per household per day. That's for washing, cooking, and consumption of water, which seems reasonable and workable. And as a family, my own family, we were able to work well within that limit. But for many families, they were actually living in backyard dwellings on another property. So in many cases, in the poor, vulnerable areas of Cape Town, there were 6 or 7 families living on one property, and so all living within that one restriction. And so when you began to work out the maths, you ended up with something like 11 liters per person per day for washing, cooking, and consumption of water, which is clearly not feasible. And so this caused a lot of anger and resentment across the city, and headlines like this emerged. Day Zero is a political attack on the people, says the Water Crisis Coalition. But really what they were doing, and what many were saying, is that there are other narratives here. There are narratives of historical exclusion, apartheid, urban planning, inequality, and injustices across the city. And these were really important narratives that contested and competed with the underlying narrative of reducing water supply. And it was a difficult moment for the city. The overarching narrative that comes out of Day Zero is that we survived. It was a story of resilience. The city managed to survive the Day Zero drought. And many of these other stories have since become lost and hidden in the process. Another story is eThekwini floods of 2022. And this is a map, again, the science and data evidence was there. This is a map of the 1 in 100-year flood levels across part of the city, and the gray blocks there are buildings. So we see many, many buildings built within this flood zone. And again, this is a pattern we see across many cities, particularly in Africa. Why are these buildings built within flood zones? Again, lots of narratives and stories around this. And often stemming back to things like the apartheid planning legacy, where people were forced to live because of apartheid policies, where people choose to live now. Even they may choose to live in high-risk areas because they're trading off access to employment opportunities, which are rare, access to good education, which is rare. So often people are making very contested and difficult trade-offs in their daily lives and placing themselves in risk, and then bearing the consequences and the impacts of that. There's also debates and stories around catchment management, around access to early warnings, and again, around underlying inequality. And the last little point here is around recovery. I just want to highlight that for many of these communities, they still have not recovered from the events of now 3 years ago. So recovery is often a really important narrative that often gets lost when the newspaper headlines disappear. So again, what all I'm trying to do here is describe the complexity of the narratives and the stories that we need to weave together, we need to hold, we need to bring together to understand these contexts and to think about action coming out of it. So yes, it's about the science knowledge and the knowledge that we can generate, but we also really need to be engaging with all the different narratives and stories that swirl around that and that are often contested. A note of positivity, if you like, has really inspired me over the years, is engaging with the youth. This really came alive for me a few years ago when we were doing some work around climate risk narratives in Namibia, in Windhoek in Namibia, and we'd been co-developing these risk narratives around climate change in Windhoek, a lot of it around water resources. And there were some youth organization representatives in the meeting, and they stood up and they said, we do not like these risk narratives. They are too negative. They are too bleak. We have positive ideas for the future. We have plans to change things into a positive direction. We want our ideas, our hopes, our aspirations represented in these narratives. And that was really challenging for me, because for me, the natural science was saying things are going in a bad direction. But also thinking, well, how do we bring these ideas, these hopes and aspirations into our thinking about the future? So that's been really inspiring, and I continue to enjoy and inspired by engaging with youth. And I see lots of opportunities for that within the Climares project. So how do we do that? Lots of different mechanisms. And we've tried lots of things over the years, and I'm sure many in the room have done similar processes. I want to highlight the photograph on the right there, two very dear people for me. Unfortunately, the lady in the photograph has passed away. She was a very passionate social scientist that taught me a lot about narratives and discourses. The man on the right there, Gilbert CMA from the University of Zambia, has been a partner for about a decade now working in Lusaka. Both of these people have taught me a lot about bringing together different perspectives, about building trust and building collaboration. And I love this photo because they're sparring, they're in a sort of jovial conflict, if you like. which really for me captures what we're trying to do. We're trying to build trust and collaboration, but not hide the diversity and the disagreements. Skip that one. So these are the kind of, this is as close as I get to storylines, the kind of processes that we try and run and that we'll be doing in Climares, where we're mapping out pathways to the future, bringing in different perspectives, and we end up with these complex woven stories you can see across the floor here. Sometimes we see the classic strong engineering planning pathway, particularly for urban adaptation projects, and that appears. But what becomes really complex is when we start looking at power and decision making. Who's involved in decision making? What is the governance configurations? How does local area development planning happen? Where are the financial resources? And so we weave together these stories and build these storylines. And where does it get us? It gets us to increased trust and collaboration, increased understanding of each other's perspectives. And from that, we can build out action that is in a response to climate change, as well as other hazards and stresses. So to conclude, for me, the science and data is this really critical piece of the puzzle of solving these wicked challenges. And we know that the data and the science informs these narratives, and often it's the narratives that guide the decision-making. Often it's the stories that people talk about at tea break that really feed into the decision-making. And that's, I think, a really important recognition. I think we got really good at turning data into narratives. As climate scientists, we've had to work on this quite a bit, and we will be doing a lot of this in Climares as well. How do we turn data into narratives? We've become better and better at that. However, whose narratives are hidden behind these data and science-driven narratives? We need to make sure that those narratives emerge, those stories of lived experience, those stories of people living in the context, are not hidden and dominated by the narratives that we bring with the science. And I think Climares is amazingly positioned to do that. The way we've set up the project, the way we thought about it, the way we thought about these knowledge action networks and chains, and the storylines process, I think is a really exciting opportunity. So we don't want the data to collapse this diversity and complexity. We want to avoid the danger of a single story. So the question to me and the challenge and the excitement is that can Climares weave the science and the data into this tapestry of narratives and our imaginaries of the future that doesn't diminish the critical value of the data and the science, but also doesn't collapse and silence the diversity and the complexity. So I'm going to end with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite authors, Chimamanda Adichie. And she says that stories matter. Many stories matter. That's really important. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. So this for me is the central passion around stories. And I'm excited to bring this thinking and ideas into Climares and see where it goes. So yeah, thank you for your time. Sorry, I may have gone on a little longer than normal, than I expected. That's normal. Again, I wish I could join the conversations that might follow from this in the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. And I hope to meet many of you in person in due course. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether Chris is attending online at the moment, as many of our peers. Okay, then I will thank Chris for his contribution. I think it's very important, and putting people at the core and their stories will be the core part of our, at least the core departure point of our action networks. But of course, we are also trying to connect these stories to the global level, for instance, and that is what Jojita is also going to help us with. Thea already introduced her briefly. She works at the University of Amsterdam, a lot on climate change, adaptation, and especially climate justice, I think is really your hot topic. And you're going to take us along in this. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I prepared a substantive presentation on climate justice because I think Climares is in some ways a just project aiming at climate justice in its own way. So basically what I want to talk about is that if you have on the x-axis time and on the y-axis greenhouse gas emissions, and we have to get our emissions to zero, this means that the amount of emissions we can emit every year is shrinking. And this means that as we go towards 2030, 2040, 2050, We are going to fight more and more with each other about who has the right to emit greenhouse gas emissions. And this is not just going to happen in a North-South context, but also in the Dutch context, and also in, this is moving too fast, also in the global context. So this means that we may not be able to agree about who has reduced emissions, and that means that there are going to be a large number of impacts in different parts of the world, and we are going to get social movements coming up and fighting everywhere, and they're going to go to court, and we are going to get a number of court cases. Right now, we have about 3,000 court cases, and the International Court of Justice has just come out with an advisory opinion, which I really love. Anyway, to cut the long story short, basically, one of the biggest injustices has been the fact that every time the politicians have postponed decisions about climate change. So instead of starting in 1990 and creating a phased storyline about how we get our emissions to zero, they've been postponing it. So now we've reached a point where we have to get it down really fast if we want to get to 1.5, which is the legally binding target according to the International Court of Justice. And that is very difficult for a country like the Netherlands to forget about other countries in the world. And this in itself might create all kinds of new injustices. If I park that, in the developing world, there has always been discussions about the fact that they would like to follow somehow in the footsteps of the global north. They all want to become richer. And that option is no longer possible, because if you want to address the climate problem at 1.5, rich countries have to get to zero, poor countries have to get to zero, because otherwise we can't get to 1.5. And so that means that we are taking away some of the ambitions and opportunities that poorer countries would have liked to have. And is that fair? And those are all justice issues that we need to think about. I have to be very careful, yeah. And if you look at the average emissions, the darker the red, the greater the emissions per capita. And this map shows that if you look at the adaptation, the impacts, the darker the red, the greater the impacts. And you can see that Africa is going to be one of the areas of the world that will have a major impact. So there is a difference between who is actually causing the problem and who is impacted. And I can show this differently. On the x-axis, you see privileged to marginalized people in terms of vulnerability to risks and impact. And you see that the marginalized have a greater existential risk. The rich have maybe a greater risk in terms of money, but the poor have a greater risk in terms of existential. But if you look at who causes the problem, it is generally the other way around. The more rich you are, the more flights you can do, the more you can invest, the greater your emissions. And this basically means that rich people generally don't want to take any action, and the poor people suffer. And this, it's of course a black and white story here. And that is partly the reason, I think, behind the divorce between knowledge and power. So let me go through the injustices one by one. The first major injustice was, even though in the Netherlands, we knew that up to 1 degree, it is green, between 1 and 2 degrees, it's orange, which means some parts of the world will suffer. And beyond 2 degrees, the whole world will suffer. Even though we knew that, the world has postponed decision-making on this topic till 2015, making it practically impossible to achieve global climate stabilization at a just level. The second injustice is the fact that if you don't know what your stabilization target is, then you don't know how big your carbon cake is, and then you don't know how to share it between countries. And so we delayed the sharing till 2015 when it was not possible to share it anymore. And so what you get now is a voluntary agreement by countries. And this voluntary agreement means that if you add up what countries promise to do, we are nowhere near the 1.5 that we should achieve. We are actually probably near 2.7. And this is a really big risk. And I don't think the 2.7 is actually correct. If you add the stranded asset risk, which is the third point, I think we will be at a much higher level. 78% of the remaining fossil fuel is in the global south, which means that if we don't in the global north make it possible for global south countries to leave their fossil fuel underground, which also means telling our export credit not to keep investing in fossil fuel in the global south and our investors not to keep investing. If we don't do that, there is no way we can achieve 1.5 or 2. We are complicit in the fact that the developing countries may use their fossil fuels, and we need to make sure that they don't. And that means we have to help them in avoiding that use. That's the first point. The second point I want to make is that the fossil fuel sector is worth between 16 trillion US dollars and 295 trillion US dollars. Global GDP is 110 trillion US dollars, which means the fossil fuel sector basically holds us in the grip of its arms. And basically, we're doing what they want us to do. And they have the resources to ensure that. If you look at the mitigation storyline over the last 35 years, we have focused on efficiency. Efficiency is great, but it's not effective and it's not just. And today the situation is that efficiency has led us to a situation, for example, in the Netherlands, where the bulk of the population does not support climate action because we did not take a just policy in the Netherlands. We financed rich people to buy solar panels, heat pumps, and electric cars. We didn't make it possible for the single mother to get off fossil fuel simply by just putting her finger on the button of the electricity. The state should have organized it for the poorer and the lower middle class people, and the rich would have organized themselves. And so what you're seeing is that even in global north countries, we have not taken a just approach. And that is also the reason why many people no longer support development cooperation, why they do not support helping the global south on these issues. They don't realize it's in their own interest. And now that we come to adaptation, and if you look at adaptation, the amount of money we've been talking about adaptation, we delayed adaptation for a very long time. Then we started to generate money for adaptation, but most of the adaptation money is coming by moving money from another area to the adaptation process. It's not as if it's additional. And if you listen to money stories, remember, don't add up what does the Dutch government do, what does the World Bank do, what does Oxfam do, and what does SNV do. It's the same money. It's the Netherlands giving the money to the World Bank, to SNV, to Oxfam, most of the time. So be careful that you don't keep adding up things because you'll get a number that's not right. Today, every hour, the damage is 15 million. And I need to know from Climares if actually these numbers are anywhere near the numbers you face when you are on the fields trying to figure out what kind of damage people are facing, whether they can adapt to it or whether it is loss and damage. And we want to generate the empirical evidence to make this story much better. The last injustice is the fact that the climate change problem is not really about mitigation. It is about lifestyles. It's about production and consumption. So basically, we should be talking about what kind of development narrative are we talking about? And we need to change our behavior here, not just do resilience there, because actually, we should make it possible for them not to have to adapt because we screwed it up for them. All right, next slide. Okay, so when you look at justice, justice can be at the local level, it can be at the global level, it can be incremental, and it can be transformative. Now, what we find is that incremental justice from the local to global level tends to reproduce injustice. The only way you can get to trying to avoid injustice in the first place is to be on the right side where we are talking about local to global iterative discussions, constantly changing each other and trying to be on the transformative side. And in this iterativeness, that is my role in this project, to try to see if I can get your evidence and bring it to the international community, collect the international community's questions, which is basically what works, what doesn't work, and why is justice important, and come back to you with those questions so that we can get that iteration going. Next slide. So in the Earth Commission, what we try to do is to understand what is justice. And one of the things we came up with was a framework. And we say, as I mentioned earlier, that it is transformative rather than incremental justice that's important. But recognition justice is really important. And this project is all about recognition. It's about the migrants, the refugees. It's about the fishermen. It's about the farmers. It's really about recognizing the poorest and the most marginalized. And that is what we want to really make much more what we want to make much more stable. All right, and then there's epistemic justice, there's data justice, and there's language justice. All these are different types of whose knowledge counts questions. Then you have interspecies, intergenerational, and intragenerational justice. Interspecies justice is so important to make sure that the ecosystem keeps providing you the services you need. And of course, you need intergenerational and intragenerational justice. I'm not entirely sure how we can incorporate this into the project, but I hope we can. Procedural justice about access to information, decision-making, protest, that's civic space, and courts. And the civic space is shrinking in many parts of Africa right now. I have heard that many African governments are trying to prevent people from going to courts on issues like climate change. So you're seeing a shrinking civic space in many African countries and also in the West. And then you have substantive justice. So basically, we translate that into ends and means. So how many people should die before we have a boundary on climate change? Where do we put the boundary on climate change? Is it 1.5, 2, 1? So after discussing for a long time how many people should be allowed to die, which we failed to conclude on, we finally concluded that on climate change, it should be 1 degree, because 1 degree means that 70 million people are exposed to death from high wet bulb temperatures already. And that is precisely the community that Climares is working on. The health of the community who are exposed to not having a house, perhaps being on the ocean, fishing. These are the people who will be exposed to heat, thirst. And that means they won't be able to function and they won't be able to live. And so it's really important that 1 degree is a just boundary, and 1.5 is the boundary after which we trigger all kinds of tipping points, which means you do not know what you're adapting to because you don't know how the system will change. So 1.5 is really serious. So for Climares, it's really important that we get our act together here in the global north to mitigate. And then we have also foundations. So let us assume we have 1 to 3 billion people worldwide without access to basic needs. If, as under the SDGs, we want to meet their basic needs to food, water, energy, infrastructure, bit of healthcare, primary education, what does that mean in terms of CO2 emissions, in terms of nitrogen, in terms of phosphorus? And we have done that calculation partly. And what that means is that basically you need to reserve a part of the carbon budget to meet the basic needs of people. But today we are outside the budget. And therefore, that means the rich people have to go down like this to make space for the poorer people to at least meet their minimum. And I get criticized for saying, why are you talking about the minimum? They should have at least a proper house. Hello, we can't even get the minimum. So how do we do this? This is really all about redistribution. It's about questioning the drivers of inequality, drivers of climate change. So essentially, my role is to try to get the structural questions that emerge and the evidence from this project. Can you go to the next slide? So in our just storyline, we have a number of questions. Is the safe boundary just? No, it's not. Can we meet minimum needs within the boundaries? Right now, we cannot. And that also means that there has to be minimum needs met through renewables or something else, but not through fossil fuel, because that will lock people up into a fossil fuel future. And that renewables has to be paid by the people who can afford it. So it can't be that that we're asking Africa to pay for this. I'm going to go to this slide now since it's here. So basically, just stop. Just see, basically the safe boundary is shown in red. The dotted blue boundary is the boundary of what it takes to meet the minimum needs of people worldwide. The blue boundary is the just boundary. Today we are at the yellow state. And the idea is to get us back into this and meet the minimum. And that is basically the operationalization of our justice narrative. Next slide. And in terms of climate, I'm going to focus at the bottom end, these two slides, these two areas. Basically, the most important thing is how do we address the drivers of climate change and inequality, because these two are the most important reasons for people not being able to both mitigate as well as adapt. So that's the key issue. And then when we come to the ends and means, we are looking at liability, collective insurance for risks. How do we correct, restore, and create transitional justice? How do we divide responsibilities so that we can create a better inclusive system? And how do we allocate the remaining carbon budget? Next slide. Now, why I find the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion really fantastic is because they take out some of the uncertainty. They say the treaty as a whole says 1.5 is the legally binding target, which is better than 2 degrees. So that's really good. Then they say all nations, whether you've ratified or not, all nations have a responsibility to prevent significant harm to other countries. And that's really significant because in 1992, the governments did not agree on that. And then third, they say that all the nationally determined targets must go further. They must add up to 1 degree, and they must be progressive. They can't fall back, and that the failure of a state to act on fossil fuel may constitute an international wrongful act. And I'm hoping that all governments have read this. And it's also about the companies within the state. So I'm very happy with this. And there were some really fantastic statements also in the annexes, which had the dissenting opinions, where people wanted to go further than these. Next slide. So basically, I think that we need domestic justice in rich countries because we want societal readiness. We need societal support for climate policy in rich countries. And we also need international justice, or we cannot convince developing countries not to use the fossil fuel within their territory. The question is, what happens to development and development aid and development cooperation? I think we have to work in our enlightened self-interest, because it is in the enlightened self-interest of the global north to make sure that everybody in the global south is happy. If the global south people are not happy and they cannot be healthy, they will come to the global north. There will be conflict. There will be many ways in which the security, sustainability, and economic well-being through the value chains will get messed up here in the global north. It's not just a question of charity. It's also a question of self-interest and enlightened self-interest. Unfortunately, politicians who are in power for only 4 years. And they don't care about the enlightened self-interest in the long term. And that is something that is really critical for our process. Next. And I think for adaptation, I wanted to make a couple of sentences. I think that in this project, while you are all focusing on trying to create resilience, we need to make sure that we may have to make them be resilient every single day to a completely changing environmental world. So there has to be some pressure on this side to make sure that we still can keep the climate under some degree of control. Otherwise, you'll be helping not just in adaptation, but in loss and damage. Having said that, the data on what are the impacts, what works in reducing impacts, what is the loss and damage, how much does it cost these people also in terms of psychological well-being, are all very important data to make the case internationally. Second, when I first came to the Netherlands in 1990, we had a project on climate change, and then we decided to reduce heating costs. We must have houses facing the south. And that advice was taken up, and there were many houses facing the south, and now we have to have fans and air conditioners. So adaptation in itself is not good enough. It has to be adaptive capacity. And it's very difficult to figure out how to adapt if you don't know where the rain is going to fall, when and how. And that's really problematic for all of us. And rain is one of the biggest issues in drought. And then, of course, adaptive capacity needs to integrate mitigation where possible. And of course, somebody else has to pay for it. So the whole discussion of who pays through liability insurance or some other kind of system is something that maybe I should be getting involved in the context between all of you. And I think I'm going to leave it there. I hope.
Thank you very much, Jojita. I guess work to do for all of us to get started now. Before we are moving to the informal drinks and meetings, I would like to say a little bit about the African partners, because initially we intended to have the Climate Academy in the Netherlands and the inception meeting in the Netherlands, which would have allowed the African, at least the PhD students, to also come and attend meetings like this. Unfortunately, this was not possible in the current setup, but we felt we still wanted to engage all the African partners as much as possible as well. So many of them are attending online, and you will have the opportunity to have a short chat with whoever you want to speak in the breakout rooms that we organize. Luciana has set up many different breakout rooms, and you're able to log in with the link that you received if you signed up to speak to some of them, following a certain schedule that has been sent around, and you should have received that, or otherwise you can check the papers that are spread in the meeting room, because they are also, of course, essential part of it. We said it's about local knowledge, about bringing in local networks as well, and bringing in the stories. But we also need support of the African university partners in the different countries. So make sure to also take that opportunity to connect to them and to get to know them, because they are essential partners in this project as well.